In this series, I'm following in the footsteps of 3 men who set out across the globe in search of lost treasures. The discoveries they made rewrote history. I'm standing in the presence of the birth of Viking art, revealing the untold story of how human societies began. What was going to come out of the ground here was going to rewrite the book of Western civilization. But these finds are not always what they seem, because the men behind them were products of their eras, driven by nationalism, colonialism, and ego, competing to stamp their mark on our shared past. This time, I've come to the island of Crete to uncover one of the most contentious discovery stories of all time. This colour with this vibrancy, oh my goodness. Just over a century ago, a rich Briton called Arthur Evans came here in search of the truth behind the most famous Greek myth of all, King Minos, and the terrifying monster known as the Minotaur he kept hidden in the depths of his palace. The underground maze, with a half-man, half-bull, flesh-eating beast within. He didn't find a man-eating monster, but what he did find were the ruins of Europe's first civilization, lost for nearly 3,000 years.
And for Evans, that was the thing that showed him it was new.
He called them the Minoans, and he spent his entire fortune on recreating their world.
These come from the excavations of Sir Arthur Evans. It's a masterpiece.
Arthur Evans is now one of archaeology's controversial characters, one whose professional imagination strayed into fiction.
Just complete and utter early 20th century fantasy.
But not only did his discovery push the start of Western culture back by 1,000 years, the civilization he unearthed was like no other. Is there any more powerful and compelling myth than that of the labyrinth and the Minotaur? The underground maze, with a half-man, half-bull, flesh-eating beast within. The story has fed into the work of Chaucer and Shakespeare, Jung and Freud, Hollywood movies, and, of course, the Percy Jackson novels, beloved by kids across the world. According to legend, Minos was king here in Crete, the largest of the Greek islands, a land of soaring cliffs, turquoise waters, and ancient ruins. Almost 3,000 years ago, the Greek poet Homer wrote about this wondrous place. Out in the middle of the wine-dark sea, there lies a land called Crete, a rich and lovely land, washed by the waves on every side, densely peopled and boasting 90 cities. There, one language mingles with another. One of the 90 towns is a great city called Knossos, and there, for 9 years, King Minos ruled and enjoyed the friendship of Almighty Zeus. This compelling tale survived for millennia. King Minos was the son of the chief of the Greek gods, Zeus, who had taken the form of a bull when he fathered him. Later, Minos' wife, Pasiphae, becomes enamored with another magnificent bull. She gets pregnant by the bull and gives birth to a dangerous monster that is half man, half bull. That's the Minotaur. It does seem to me that King Minos has a rather uncomfortable relationship with bulls. Anyway, he wants to imprison this monster, so builds a labyrinth beneath his palace. There, the Minotaur is fed on a regular supply of young bodies. Finally, the hero, Theseus, manages to slay the Minotaur, and he escapes the labyrinth. By the Victorian era, the culture of ancient Greece was central to the identity of the Western world. Not just because of their fantastic stories, but because they were regarded as the world's first democracy. The great 19th century Western powers aspired to model themselves on it. Arthur Evans arrived on Crete in 1894, determined to find King Minos's palace. One of his first stops was a valley in the middle of the island. Sandy McGilvery is an archaeologist based on Crete, who's written a biography of Arthur. Oh gosh, look at that view. That is incredible. In terms of ancient Greece, for men like Arthur Evans, why was it so important to them?
Ancient Greece was a fundamental part of every well-educated person's education. Within that, you get all the history and you get all the mythology. And so this is very much a part of who you are.
The young Arthur was sent to the exclusive Harrow School, where he was taught Britain was the natural successor to ancient Greece. But when Arthur was just a teenager, the world was stunned by an incredible discovery. The legendary Greek city of Troy, famous for the beautiful Helen, was real. The man who found it was Heinrich Schliemann.
Heinrich Schliemann was a German entrepreneur. He made a sufficient fortune to become self-financed, and in 1876, with enough money behind him, he was able to go to Troy, and he began excavating, and he found what we still call Troy today.
This discovery made Schliemann world famous.
Schliemann goes to London, lectures about it. Arthur Evans, as a young man then, a young professional, sees that this is something new. It's very, very new, very exciting.
Suddenly, there was a whole new dimension to ancient Greece, the real history behind its legends. And as the myth of King Minos included a lost palace, finding it was the biggest prize of all. Obviously, it captured Arthur Evans' imagination. Was it just Schliemann and Evans up against each other in this race?
No, it's definitely not Arthur Evans and Schliemann alone. You had an American interest coming in, and you had a French interest coming in as well. And so there was basically a race. It's almost like a colonial race to go and see who's going to plant their flag on this site.
In the valley just below the very spot where Sandy and I are standing, coins had been discovered, engraved on one side with the image of a labyrinth. This was a huge clue, but the question was, who could get the rights to excavate? When Arthur left Crete after his first visit in 1894, he was already hell-bent on winning the race to find King Minos's palace and labyrinth. He wrote home saying, "I am determined on the archaeological conquest of this island." Arthur's single-mindedness began back in Britain, where he was curator of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, my hometown. I love this place. I've been coming here my whole life to gaze upon its collection of artifacts and curiosities from across the world. Arthur Evans was once the curator here, and it now houses his personal archives. Andrew Chaplin now has Arthur's old job. Andrew, tell me about Arthur Evans. What was it that set him on this path towards international archaeology?
Arthur Evans, his father, is actually an amateur archaeologist. He's made his money in paper manufacturing. He's the director of the family business. And young Arthur used to accompany John on his expeditions to find new artefacts and also to find things like coins to add to his collections.
Arthur's father made his fortune on the back of the Industrial Revolution. Arthur had a happy early childhood, but when he was just 6, in 1857, it was shattered by the death of his mother, Harriet. He was sent to board at Harrow, where a typical public school education in the classics fueled a lonely adolescent passion for the Greek myths.
We have a map of the Aegean here that he did while he was at Harrow. He's marked all of the important Roman cities around the Aegean, including Knossos. There's almost a sense of destiny in this map.
Even at this very young age, he's drawn to this area, isn't he?
No, absolutely.
OK, so he's inherited money, he's born into it, and he has this fantastic, privileged education. Sounds like he's very much part of the English establishment, is that right?
Yes, although it doesn't entirely go as smoothly as you might think. After he'd left university, he went off travelling, went to Bosnia, and he becomes a journalist. It was the time when the Ottoman Empire was disintegrating.
Arthur wanted travel and adventure, not a safe job in the family business. And it was in the Balkans he met his wife, Margaret. He sounds like a pretty fearless guy.
Well, he is. Margaret spent a lot of time worrying about him as he went off to talk to the rebel leaders in the mountains and had various scrapes. I think Arthur Evans often felt that being an Englishman, he could be guaranteed of safety, whereas maybe that wasn't always true.
The late 19th century was an age of empires. While Britain, Germany and France scrambled for territory in Africa and Asia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire snatched control of the Balkans. It was a dangerous place for a journalist, and Arthur loved it.
He was almost too fearless because he ended up sending dispatches back to the Manchester Guardian, his paper, and they eventually got fed up with that and arrested him as a spy and put him in prison. He was eventually let out of prison on condition that he never came back.
In 1884, the job of curator of the Ashmolean came free. It was perfect. Like Arthur, Margaret loved the mysteries of the ancient world. For the next decade, they enjoyed long sabbaticals, adventuring around the Mediterranean, spending Arthur's fortune buying treasures for the museum. But it was one key find that would transform Arthur from collector to discoverer. The vital clue that set Arthur on his quest for Knossos was one of these. This is a seal stone. It's made of a precious or semi-precious gem that's incised into so that when it's pressed into clay, it leaves an inscription, a bit like a signet ring. But Arthur recognised there must be some sort of lost written script or language. And the more he began to research them, he found that all these seal stones seemed to be coming from Crete. If there was this ancient forgotten language in Crete, then perhaps there could also be an ancient forgotten civilization there too. But then tragedy struck. In 1893, Margaret died, aged just 45. Arthur never married again, and for the rest of his life, he wrote on black-bordered stationery in mourning for her. Arthur needed to fill the huge hole in his life, so he headed for Crete, determined that he would be the man to find King Minos's palace of Knossos. Arthur got straight to work, buying up the land the labyrinth coins had been found on to make sure that no one else could dig.
Of course, it was only a brilliant plan because he had the immense fortune needed to back it up. He began using all of his inheritance, buying up the lion's share of the land around Knossos. It was a monumental gamble. And in some ways, it's kind of an uncomfortable thought, really, that this incredibly rich and privileged Englishman was essentially buying the rights to an entire civilization.
Now Arthur just had to wait. It took 5 long years, but he finally got permission to excavate.
On the morning of March 23rd, 1900, Arthur set out from here, Heraklion, and headed for the hills to the reputed site of Knossos. Now, it was his long-held dream, but I can't help imagining just how nervous he must have been. He's nearly 50. He's lost his wife, he's dumped his career, and he has staked all of his inheritance on this. What if it turns out to just be a mirage?
Colin MacDonald was director of Knossos in the 1990s.
So, can you set the scene for me, Colin, on this first day of excavation? It's exciting. How's it going to pan out?
There's a certain colonial atmosphere, I suppose, to the fact that the British are digging Knossos, the Italians are digging Festos, the French are digging Malia. You know, each foreign European country seems to have a palace.
And this sounds like a big dig.
The team of 100 or so workmen that he had were largely local workmen, both Muslim and Christian Orthodox, who lived locally. And what is always crucial here is people who have experience in working the land. They understand changes in soils. And Evans, the men, they set themselves up on the mound with a tent, possibly a Union Jack, who knows.
As owner and paymaster, Arthur was in total control, and he wanted results.
A system was introduced called the wages system, whereby the different teams were told, dig down until you find the first floor. And that tended to be a stone floor, and then they would get a reward for having been the first to find something decent.
So they were digging fast then?
Yes, the wages system meant speed was of the essence, trying to uncover as much of the site as possible, really.
Unfortunately, in their haste, the diggers destroyed the more recent Roman and Greek layers. But very quickly, they were unearthing incredible finds. March 30th, day 7. In his diary, Arthur writes, "Today, 2 remarkable objects turned up. Fragments with script and what appear to be numerals." April 5th, day 13. A great day. 2 large pieces of fresco of a female figure. Then, on the 13th of April, came the find that proved Arthur's big gamble had paid off. Colin's taking me into the heart of the palace.
He was digging on the west side of the palace and came down into the throne room by chance and discovered this amazing throne in its original place with frescoes on either side, and frescoes actually right the way around the whole room.
Gosh, it must have just astonished the world what was coming out of this site at that point.
I think it did, and also we must remember it was in the days when people really read things. And so the first notice of this was in the Times, 2 long columns in August the 10th, 1900, without any illustrations whatsoever. The description of the entire first season is there in the newspaper for people to read. You would never dare do such a thing today.
No. I mean, this is superstar archaeology, isn't it?
Yes, yes. Well, certainly by the end of the first season, he knew he had found the palace at Knossos, whatever it was.
He must have seen this throne and thought it was something special.
Yes, he thought it was very special. And it's very interesting because it's extremely delicately carved, even to the extent of the buttocks of the person who sat there being carved. He at first thought that it was a female.
So when he's conducting this first stage of excavation, Arthur Evans is certain that this is the throne that has a female buttock upon it. Why did he then later change his mind and think it was a throne for a man?
I think that after the first season, Evans begins to think more in terms of the whole of the excavation rather than individual finds. And that, particularly with the background of the mythological background, as it were, associated with Knossos, it seems that he would really rather like to find where the ruler, Minos, might have sat, and there it is. This seemed to work for him.
In archaeology, evidence only gets you so far. Archaeologists always have to fill in the gaps with their own knowledge and imagination. Arthur expected to unearth the palace of a king, so it was just a small jump for him to announce that he'd found King Minos's throne. Although his imagination could stretch quite far.
Evans even wrote, at the end of his first season of digging, this huge building with its maze of corridors was, in fact, the labyrinth for the Minotaur. I mean, that is a seriously bold claim.
Arthur made Knossos front page news. Part of the story was its age. Like Troy, it pushed the beginnings of ancient Greece back by 1,000 years. To a world obsessed with the ancient Greeks, this was huge. A whole new chapter just waiting to be explored. It even got its own name, Mycenaean Greece.
But that was going to be nothing. That was going to be dwarfed by what would happen in the second stage of the excavations. Because what was going to come out of the ground here at Knossos was going to rewrite the book of Western civilization.
We're actually walking on the original ancient road which ran from the town of Knossos, which was behind us, to the palace itself, which is before us here.
Before Arthur's dig, Knossos had been completely buried for millennia. In spring 1901, he reached the palace's deepest, oldest layers.
Interestingly, what we see before us is a perfect example of, as it were, the antiquity of the entire site.
This humble-looking stone.
This humble-looking set of stones.
Yeah, okay.
Well, the bottom one goes back to the middle of the third millennium, about 2,500. Up above it is about 2,300. And then this dress block on top probably actually goes down to about 1700 BC and is typical of the finest masonry of the palace.
To Arthur's shock, this foundation layer was 3,500 years old. When he examined the finds within it, he realised he was looking at a whole new civilization.
All of this allows you to see the development, the artistic development of a civilization, and for Evans, that was the thing that showed him it was new.
Very rapidly, it must have been really blowing Arthur's mind what he was getting back.
Yes, it was different from what was known from the mainland. So this is a culture, a new culture, as it were, and that's why he decided to use a different word and call it Minoan, after King Minos.
It seemed Arthur had succeeded in finding the real palace behind the Minos myth. But now he revealed it was built by a lost people he called the Minoans. And they, not the Greeks, were the founders of Western civilization.
Scale of these stones. They're massive. God, doesn't it just make you see this place so differently when you imagine it with this colour, with this vibrancy. It's just overwhelming. Look how beautiful the figures are. Oh.
It would take Arthur 3 decades to dig Knossos out from this hillside. As he did, the world discovered that the real story was much bigger than the myth. Knossos was more than a palace. It was the control centre of a trading empire that spread far beyond the island of Crete.
It's kind of strange to have read about this place since I was a child and to finally be standing here. Oh my goodness. This is not a fledgling civilization. This is not a civilization finding itself. This is a fully grown, confident civilization that can afford to have spaces like this to entertain thousands of people potentially. The size of it, it's like a banner, isn't it? This is Minoan civilization.
I think it's often the small discoveries that reveal the intimate details of people's lives. So I'm spending the day in Heraclean Museum to immerse myself in the art the Minoans left behind. The Minoans' wealth came from commerce. Their trading empire spread through Greece, around the Aegean, to Egypt and the Middle East. Professor Jan Driesen has spent 40 years unlocking the Minoans' secrets.
One of his ideas that the Minoans were ruling the waves, sort of the Mediterranean and the Aegean, is actually shown by the representation of these little boats. You see these terracotta boats, which date already.
Beautiful.
Which already date to the very beginning of the Minoan civilization, and which shows the transport, the means of transport with which they sort of like made their overseas trips.
To Arthur, this must have been evidence quite early on that the Minoans were I suppose, a sort of maritime empire.
He found like an ideal British world, which was slowly disappearing at that time, I think, still represented on the island of Crete.
Oh, wow, there are some absolutely beautiful pieces in here. Look at the detailing on the tentacles of that sea creature. But it is interesting if you compare it with ancient Greek art, which is very figural, it's sort of homocentric, putting humankind at the centre of existence and controlling nature. This is a love of nature in its own right.
There's also a lot of observation behind it.
Yeah.
Because you have to know what an octopus or an argonaut does, or you have to know how the reed actually moves into the wind to be able to depict something like that. This love for nature is something which distinguished the Minoans, and Arthur realized this very early on, from the other civilizations of the Mediterranean.
What's even more striking is what Minoan art says about Minoan women.
Well, Jan, these are the objects I have most wanted to see. They are stunning. stunning, are they not?
They are. Yeah. Evans found these in 1903 in the Palace of Knossos, and they were in fragments, but he restored them. And the two ladies represented here with their bare bosoms and the detail given to their costumes, for instance, the snakes that they're holding, or on the tiara of the other lady. And these immediately became emblematic for what he called the mother goddess on the island of Crete.
Do you know, Jan, I find it wonderful in a way that when you're looking through this museum, but also through Minoan art more generally, you're actually trying to find representations of men rather than of women. It almost throughout history, it's the other way around, isn't it?
There are male representations, but they certainly don't get the same attention. Men are represented in almost a stereotype way.
Again, it makes the Minoans seem incredibly impressive in my viewpoint.
Well, I mean, they're unique.
Until now, we'd believed European history began with male-dominated ancient Greece, a culture that subjugated women. The idea that Western civilization was founded by a society in which women had real status was revolutionary. Arthur also found the likely source of the myth of the monstrous Minotaur. The bull was a symbol of Minoan power. Arthur made Knossos one of the world's most famous discoveries, and himself one of its most famous archaeologists. He wrote long volumes on his great achievements. But there was one chapter he deliberately chose not to write. Cretan archaeologist Samantha Seamery has researched early digs at Knossos.
So, Nina, I wanted you to see this house, which is now the Historical Museum of Crete. This used to be the mansion, the family house of a very important man who played a crucial role in the archaeology of Knossos. His name was Minos Kalokerinos.
Shockingly, Minos Kalokerinos discovered Knossos 20 years before Arthur.
How did Minos first get started with his excavations at Knossos?
His excavations started in 1878. The main excavation season was for 3 weeks. He discovered 12 fully preserved storage jars we call pithoi. On Evans's first visit on Crete, he was shown to the findings at Knossos by Kalokerinos himself. Evans knew what Kalokerinos had discovered.
Do you think Minos has been recognized enough?
I think Evans completely omitted Kalokerinos from his contribution and from his diggings at Knossos. Even though he had many opportunities to mention his name, his volumes were vast about Knossos. But Minos is only referenced as a nobleman of Candia, modern Iraklio, and his efforts at Knossos are mentioned as the promiscuous digs. But we have to remember there was no textbook at the time. Any excavation would pretty much look promiscuous.
By promiscuous, Arthur meant careless. But when Kalokerinos' logbooks were rediscovered, it was clear he dug with love and care.
He wanted to use the antiquities at Knossos to promote the unification of Crete with Greece.
Arthur Evans used his wealth to write Milos Kalokerinos out of history. It's only very recently that Crete erected a statue to honor Minos alongside him.
It's interesting that Arthur Evans came to Crete in the first place because of the myths associated with it. The fact that he dug at Knossos, that was down to the legends of the Minotaur and the labyrinth. So it's somewhat ironic, really, that he ends up writing his own legend about himself, saying that he was the one who discovered Knossos.
And if he made that up, what else did he invent? Walking through Knossos, the bright splashes of Arthur's restoration stand out.
This is the north entrance passage, right?
Okay.
Sandy McGilvery knows the story of every stone on this site.
This is the icon. Everyone who makes postcards, sees postcards of Knossos, they even made a postage stamp in the 1930s in Crete of Knossos. This is the image they used.
So what evidence did Arthur base his reconstruction on?
I mean, how much of this could he have drawn inspiration from the actual Minoan?
There were fragments of that fresco found down below here, but this whole bastion that he's put up here just goes with the idea of having an impressive entrance, which it is. But the idea of putting a colonnade in front of it, all that stuff, just complete and utter early 20th century fantasy.
I find that actually really astonishing. You know, even if there were whole bases for the columns, then at least you could kind of justify putting this up. But I mean, this is stage setting, isn't it, in that case?
Yeah. It's making an impressive entrance.
But the reconstruction is all from Evans's imagination.
Yeah, so it's a bit of a shocker.
Yeah.
The bull fresco is based on actual finds, but the pillars are Arthur's own, inspired by the Victorian and Art Deco designs of his own lifetime. In fact, Arthur didn't just imagine what the palace looked like, but also who lived in it.
Oh, wow.
So this is the so-called domestic quarter. That's what Evans called it, because you have him giving you a queen's megaron where the ladies could sip their tea or whatever. And then you have the king's megaron because it's bigger. A megaron means a big room. So essentially what Evans does here is he devotes spaces to the royal family, an entirely fictitious royal family.
So there is no evidence for a royal family?
We've never had any evidence for king or queen. And he then gives you a reconstructed space here when he imagines that there's this monarch who comes here to be alone, so much so that he gives him a little courtyard here. And
there was never a wall here at all. Now we know that Knossos was part temple and part administrative centre. But Arthur, born in the age of empire, could only conceive of an imperial palace.
He's creating a world of his liking, the world that he comes from, the world that he reckons he belongs in.
So it sort of seems like he's filling in the gaps, if you like, with his own views, his own ideologies.
Yeah, filling in the gaps, my goodness.
Concreting in the gaps.
He's filling in the gaps with reinforced concrete.
Some rebuilding was essential to protect the ancient stones from weather damage.
There is a 20th century monument set on a prehistoric monument, but at the same time, the prehistoric monument would have washed away by now. There would have been nothing here. It had to be conserved. He just went a little over the top.
Arthur began excavating in 1900, at the height of the British Empire. He dug for nearly 3 decades as the old certainties of imperial power crumbled away. He saw the mechanized warfare of World War I destroy great buildings, like Reims Cathedral in France, and he feared for the future of civilization. In rebuilding Knossos, he believed he could preserve the story of how civilization began. He was also a populist. Visitors flocked to Knossos because of Arthur's efforts to bring it alive for everyone. All archaeologists have to imagine what ancient ruined art would once have looked like. But Arthur was different. He created reproductions and put them back into the site.
So if you've ever visited ancient ruins, somewhere like Pompeii, for example, I think the thing that always strikes me is how stripped out the spaces are. Archaeologists have taken all of the art, all of the treasures, and put them in museums. By utilising the frescoes, putting them in these spaces, it feels much more believable. I could imagine being in this space 3,000 odd years ago and just seeing the art. It's so beautiful.
Arthur devoted the rest of his life and almost his entire fortune to bringing Knossos to life. Until his death in 1941, aged 90, he maintained an iron grip on how the Minoan story was told. But after that, his vision came under attack. One of the most important discoveries at Knossos were clay tablets covered with what Arthur thought were indecipherable Minoan languages. In 1952, a pair of British scholars, one a former World War II Nazi codebreaker, began to decipher them.
After a lot of trials and errors, he tried out Greek.
They compared a tablet from Knossos with one from the Greek mainland.
Where you had little drawings of a tripod vase and a word with 3 groups, 3 signs written underneath it. So he assumed this was tripod, and it actually worked. So he said, "Ti-ri-po," tripod. He actually reconstructed the language step by step. When they announced this on the BBC, it was like a big surprise because nobody expected this to be Greek. So everything was turned around, upside down. So we had to review a lot of things.
It turned out Arthur was wrong. This language wasn't Minoan, it was early Greek. This was a dramatic knock to his entire interpretation of the Minoans, that they were fundamentally separate to the Greeks.
So in a way, these are kicking off a reassessment of Arthur Evans's approaches?
Yes, because the decipherment of Linear B in 1952 was the first breakthrough in fact, deconstructing the Evans myth of Minoan civilization.
Very quickly, the cracks began to spread to other corners of Arthur's vision. I'm back at Heracleion Museum to look a bit more closely at this beauty, the Prince of the Lilies. The priest king Arthur believed ruled the Minoans.
But if you look closely at it, you see that it's actually made up of different fragments that maybe have nothing to do with each other. The bottom part, you see that this is like a leg going to the left, whereas the torso is actually a man facing the right. Evans put this all together within a single monolithic scheme of the priest king. And so King Minos was born through this image.
I know it's difficult to project back 100 years, but do you think Arthur was in any way trying to deliberately mislead with this reconstruction?
I don't think so. He was trying to figure out what this civilization was. But of course, he didn't know better, because he didn't have any comparative material at the time. He knew about priest kings in Mesopotamia, he knew about the pharaohs in Egypt.
As far as Arthur was concerned, all ancient civilizations had male rulers. Jan thinks Arthur missed what made the Minoans unique.
We have comparative evidence which actually shows that it's a female person sitting on this throne, either a priestess or a priestess reincarnating, representing, reenacting the great goddess.
While he restored the portraits of Minoan priestesses, Arthur couldn't conceive of them having earthly power, but I can.
Just look at this gorgeous woman. So she's known as La Parisienne because a French art historian made the bold claim that this 3,500-year-old fresco of a woman would not look out of place on the front cover of Vogue Paris in the 1920s. She is just glorious. The way that her eye makeup has been outlined, you can see that the women of Knossos were painting their faces white. They were using kohl to outline their eyes and colouring their lips bright red. And you can tell she's probably a priestess because she has this sacral knot fabric at the back of her outfit here. You could see a woman that sort of has freedom and beauty and power all in one.
Arthur's upper-class Victorian mindset underestimated Minoan women, but there were other Minoans whose lives he simply ignored. Now, new generations of archaeologists have got their hands on the evidence he uncovered. One of these is Kostis Christakis, head of the British school at Crete, which is based next to Arthur's old home.
Gosh, what a beautiful place.
Yes, this is Villa Ariadne. It's a beautiful Victorian-style manorial building surrounded by a garden.
These cicadas are the loudest on Crete.
This is my nightmare because, okay, I live in a very beautiful place like Villa Ariadne. However, to wake up every morning, let's say around 6:30, hearing that noise, it is a nightmare, really.
Arthur lived here in high Victorian style.
We can imagine Evans drinking his tea like the typical English gentleman and be proud for his astonishing achievement because Evans was a great scholar. In this book, there is the first map of the city of Knossos according to Evans' estimate.
Arthur made this map to show the city that surrounded the palace. It was home to tens of thousands of people, the biggest city in ancient Europe. The school now analyses thousands of finds from Arthur's decades of digging.
Actually, this comes from the excavations of Sir Arthur Evans in the palace, and it's a masterpiece. And you can realize it from the quality of clay, from the firing, from the way the painter took his brush, his or her brush, we don't know, and make these beautiful decorative elements.
Very few Minoans were rich enough to own things like this.
But he was selective with his material, wasn't he?
It was highly selected because during that period, they used to keep only nice stuff.
Arthur's focus was always on the elite. Now, Kostis is using the finds he discarded to reveal the lives of ordinary Minoans.
Conical cups, like this one, simple, undecorated conical cups, massively produced, were overlooked.
Yeah.
Mostly used by the ordinary people, by the poor people.
These are the things they're using every day. These are the cups they're drinking their liquid in.
They use and then they throw. You know, the conical cups for the Minoans were like our plastic or party cups. And also you can see here the fingers of the potter. So let's say that holding this cup, it's like to have a intimate contact with the person who made it or the person who used it.
Oh, I love that. The fingerprint there, it's almost like by touching that, you're sort of holding hands with someone from the past. I mean, for me, you've got the sense that Arthur Evans is sort of the foundation, and then all these other archaeologists are building onto that and creating a bigger picture.
Sir Arthur Evans was the product of its time, because archaeology is a science which evolves and changes.
Every year, archaeologists from across the world come to Crete to crack the many remaining puzzles of the Minoan Empire. They've discovered towns, temples, and forts. One of the biggest Minoan mysteries is how such a rich and advanced culture seemingly disappeared without trace. But Sandy McGilvery has found some crucial evidence at the Minoan city of Palikastro, on the eastern edge of Crete.
We've only excavated a small part of the town, it would have stretched around here probably a kilometer long. So we're looking at a population of around 30,000.
30,000. That seems to me
It's
like a big population.
Yeah,
for
it's
an
kind of like a
18th
small
century.
city, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Wow. I'm walking on a 3,000 plus year old road.
Exactly. It's very, very luxurious with those cut sandstone blocks. I mean, it really was a very well-to-do city.
Palicastro was the second largest city of the Minoan Empire and a major religious centre.
We've come up to the crossroads on the site, then it goes up through here.
Oh,
But
wow.
here on the main street, we have this.
This beautiful boulder.
This boulder is no ordinary boulder. In ancient Greek, it's called a beetle. And we see in Minoan art that young men and women drape themselves over it.
What, like hug it?
Yeah.
Wow, what will be the result of me hugging
You
the
will
boulder?
you will tell us.
Okay.
So kneel down, and you have to connect your omphalos.
My omphalos,
Yeah.
my belly button.
Yeah, you connect your belly button to it.
Oh.
And just take a deep breath. How's that?
This is gorgeous. I don't know if it's the wonderful Cretan sun on my back, the fact I'm getting a lie down, or some cosmic energy, but this is a really nice experience.
150 kilometres north of this coast is the island of Santorini. 3,500 years ago, Santorini experienced the biggest volcanic eruption in history, triggering a mega tsunami that hit Crete. The coastline here is full of evidence.
One day I was walking by and I noticed that there were potsherds in it, so it couldn't be millions of years old.
This outcrop is actually made of debris from a destroyed section of the city.
So we're looking at the archaeology, the remains of a disaster.
Of a disaster, the archaeology of a tsunami. So
Good
imagine
grief.
a wave coming in at least
Oh.
9 meters high here and going inland, and it's the length of the wave as well, 15 kilometers.
Naturally, many experts came to believe it was the tsunami that finished the Minoans. But when Sandy began his excavations here, he realised that after the disaster, the city had been rebuilt.
I'll let you do the jump first.
The billy goat jump.
What he also found were alarming signs of a different kind of violence.
This building, when we found it, was completely destroyed by fire.
Wow.
So in here, what we have is the evidence, like really, really clear evidence for how this building was destroyed. If you look here, you can see where a wooden post came up here. So there's still an imprint there. The wood is gone. Yeah.
So we know there was this huge fire, it was an inferno.
Evidence on the brickwork shows how the fire spread.
They lit the fire, they stoked the building, and then cut off the oxygen, brought the oxygen back in and blew that whole wall out, basically.
As the Minoans desperately tried to rebuild after the tsunami, attackers took advantage of their weakened state.
They burn every single town in Crete and every single building except for the palace at Knossos. Someone doesn't like them very much.
Who is doing this?
Sandy unearthed evidence during his excavations.
Come and meet our little friend here.
Absolutely stunning.
This is the Minoans' last artistic masterpiece. Despite their peaceful reputation, it's the figure of a soldier.
How did you find this incredible statue?
We found him blown apart. We found him in hundreds and hundreds of pieces, all burnt. And we had to sieve the soil, 6 tons of soil, to get all these fragments out.
Yeah. What's it made of?
The body itself is made of hippopotamus canines, ivory tusks, And then you have a serpentinite head, and the eyes, which really shocked us, are inlaid rock crystal eyes.
Why do we think that they're investing so much in this object?
We're looking at a time period after the Santorini eruption, where a lot of Crete has been destroyed. What we see in the Minoan art now is the rise of a warrior class. I think it's always been there. It's always been there, out to sea, protecting people. But now it's really crucial because they're vulnerable.
Soldiers like this were their last hope.
This is a young man, we think he's right at the end of his military training because he's stepping forward. Now he's going to join the ranks.
Sandy believes it was symbolically broken by the invading forces of Greece.
So you think it was destroyed by the Mycenaeans?
I think so, yeah. I think because of what he represents. He's this great hero of your enemy, basically, and the first thing you want to do is just smash it to bits, which is exactly what they do.
Arthur never found the evidence to tell this final, brutal chapter.
It's quite wonderful to think, really, isn't it, that Evans establishes this approach to Minoan civilization, but then each subsequent generation of archaeologists sort of unpacks that, puts it back together.
Well, it's kind of like Oscar Wilde says, every generation has not only the privilege, but the duty to rewrite history. Arthur Evans, was a Victorian Englishman. I'm not.
The Minoans flourished here over 3,000 years ago. But now we know they were conquered and submerged into Greece. Was Arthur right to call them Europe's first civilization?
We know that Arthur Evans didn't get everything right, but in your opinion, Sandy, what was his contribution? What is his legacy?
A lot of the ancient Greek mythology and religion is plucked out of Crete. They're also picking up lots and lots of ideas, picking up artistic traditions. In finding the Minoans, he does actually push European cultures back to 2000 BC. So he gives us a brand new chapter in history.
Arthur Evans' fortune gave him the opportunity to discover the Minoans. He didn't share this glory with his colleagues. And he imposed his Victorian viewpoint on a people from the past.
I, to a certain degree, share Arthur Evans's vision of this Minoan civilization. I feel intoxicated by this society that foregrounds women, that celebrates the natural world in such beautiful artworks.
Arthur never found the Minotaur's lair, but what he did find was much more vital. His rewriting of the beginning of the Western world is still radical today.
Very few people can say that they discovered a lost civilization. Arthur Evans is one of those few.